Here we have Battle of Bonnymuir. Let us never weary in remembering them, or the reasons why they came to this place. Their cause was just.
Welcome, everyone. This week's podcast is the first part of a two-parter, and it's another one in the series of podcasts we've been doing, just looking a wee bit into various events in Scottish history. What we're looking at in these two podcasts is the 1820 Radical Uprising. What happened was I got an email from Mary McCabe, who's in the 1820 Radical Society, and it was about a bus tour that was being put on, and they were going to go around some of the places associated with the uprising. So we definitely didn't go on it. Can't quite remember what the background to that was.
We only heard about it the night before. And we just didn't have time to get organised to be on it. Otherwise, we would have loved to go. It sounded really interesting. I mean, a bus trip.
I know.
Looking at our history, what could be more fun?
It's the kind of things my granny used to go on bus trips all the time, actually. So now I'm thinking, oh dear, now I've become sort of someone who's enamoured of going on a bus trip. But it did sound really interesting. And anyway, through all that, we got in touch with the secretary of the 1820 Society. He suggested we talk to Tom Dowds, who's also in the Society, and he's a historian. He's written a book about the 1820 uprising. So eventually, it did take us a while, didn't it? Eventually, we got a recording done with Tom. We just said to Tom, tell us about the uprising, and he's such a good storyteller.
Fabulous storyteller. We were absolutely engrossed in the story as he told.
I was just sitting like this the whole time to listen to it. It was so good, wasn't it? However, we also did a bit of going round the countryside ourselves, haven't we, over the past few weeks?
I mean, I think it just brings it to life a bit when you're looking at the landscape in which things happened. We were in Sighthill Cemetery in Glasgow. I was up on Bonnymuir looking for another monument. We found the toll booth in Stirling. We went to the Stirling Smith, and actually found the executioner's axe. So it's taken us all over the place, which has been absolutely fascinating.
I'm just thinking the fact that we've just now mentioned to everyone the executioner's axe, you know immediately that people lost their lives in this rebellion. There was a chase, they were arrested. There were trials, not just in Stirling, there were trials in Glasgow and Paisley and Dumbarton. Absolutely fascinating.
There was so much story, and we didn't want to miss any of the good bits out, so we split it into two parts. Part one, which is what this one is, the context in which all this happened. Then the actual uprising itself, which in many ways is a sort of short bit of the history, and then the aftermath as people are hunted down and arrested, and the ripples that go through society of the day as people think, well, there's revolution in the air, what's going on? And then when we get on to part two, there's the most amazing courtroom drama. There's one juror who holds out and saves the lives of possibly dozens of the radicals. There's spies. So shall we head over to the studio?
It's really good to have you. Maybe we could start off. Could you just say a bit about, just a wee bit of background, and then we could move into talking about what actually happened back then?
In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, well, for a start, the obvious thing was the troops came back.
Yeah.
And they were looking for work. But employers then used the opportunity to depress wages. And there was also a trade depression, which meant that there was no way they would have employment for everyone. So unemployment went through the roof. Wages fell. In this background, you have the people at Manchester, the Peterloo Massacre. There was a cross-border connection. Weavers, the higher, the better paid people, their wages fell by nearly 50%.
Wow.
And at the same time, prices were going up. So you have a double whammy.
Yeah.
Some took to the streets, and the Peterloo Massacre is just one example, more extreme, of what happened.
Now, if like us, you're going, the what? The Peterloo Massacre? What was that? Here's a little bit of background just for context. The Peterloo Massacre took place at St Peter's Field in Manchester on the 16th of August 1819. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the acute economic slump that Tom's just mentioned, and chronic unemployment and failure of harvests worsened by the Corn Laws, which kept the price of bread high, at that time only 11% of adult males had the vote. Very few of them in the industrial north of England. Radicals in Manchester identified parliamentary reform as the solution, and a mass campaign to petition Parliament for manhood suffrage, or giving the vote to men, gained 750,000 signatures in 1817, but was flatly rejected by the House of Commons. This might be starting to sound very familiar to Scottish listeners. When a second slump occurred early in 1819, radicals sought to mobilise huge crowds to force the government to back down. The movement was particularly strong in the northwest, where the Manchester Patriotic Union organised a mass rally in August 1819. Shortly after the meeting began, local magistrates called on the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry to arrest the speaker and several others on the platform with him. The Yeomanry charged into the crowd, knocking down a woman, killing a child, and finally apprehended the leader of the radicals. Cheshire magistrates then summoned the 15th Hussars to disperse the crowd. These are soldiers on horses. They charged with sabres drawn. Between 9 and 17 people were killed and 400 to 700 injured. The event was first labelled the Peterloo Massacre by the Radical Manchester Observer newspaper in a bitterly ironic reference to the bloody Battle of Waterloo, which had taken place 4 years earlier. Now back to our story.
Other demonstrations took place. Paisley in particular and that's why Paisley didn't take part in the rising. There were too many troops watching them for them to be able to. So round about the beginning of the year, let's say January, February and into March, there were groups formed to try and agitate for some reform of Parliament. Now, think of the timing. You're talking about 1820. After the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the rising in Ireland in 1798. So you have a government that is in panic mode. And what has been forgotten, in February 1820, there were disturbances in the Highlands caused by clearances. So if you are sitting in Westminster, you see risings in the Highlands. You see demonstrations in all the towns in Scotland. You see revolution. Now, here is where we have a big argument. A committee was formed in Glasgow called a Committee for the Setting Up of a Provisional Government in Scotland.
I'm just laughing because Westminster wouldn't have liked that, would they?
Well, here you have a problem. Have the Irish not just tried to do that 20 years ago? And oh my God. And the police commissioner here in Glasgow, Mitchell, he referred to them as Jacobins. Yeah. You have that connection.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing the government did was they raised troops. Now, you may have heard of the Tronent massacre where they objected to the recruitment of troops to be sent. It's like an early form of conscription. They also had volunteer regiments. If we leave aside troops like militia who could serve abroad, but they could be raised, you had yeomanry. Now, they were usually the country gentlemen, and they were cavalry. And then you had what were sometimes called armed associations, sometimes volunteer units. I'll use the word volunteer. They were officered by the upper middle class and the lower middle class. If I can give you the classic example, and the one that I really want to hammer, the owner / editor of the Glasgow Herald raised a regiment called the Glasgow Sharpshooters, and they had them dressed in a spectacular uniform. He had been with the militia in Ireland in 1798, and he saw this as another Irish revolution. I still ponder, and not everyone will agree with this, but when the trials came round, the first man to be put to the bar in the first trial in Stirling was an Irishman. Man, he was young, but he was Irish. He had an Irish accent. He was from County Down, and he was the first put up to the bar. And I think they were making the connection psychologically, not necessarily spelling it out. In March, the entire organising committee in Glasgow was arrested. This was just after one of the men by the name of King left the meeting. Yes, he actually was in the pay of the authorities. What is intriguing is the two results of that. Result one, Mitchell, the police captain in Glasgow, writes to Lord Sidmouth saying, if there were to be a scheme to bring the radicals out into the open, we could crush them. No one has ever found one single member of that group ever having been brought to trial. We don't even know where they were held. We do know that some were released because they were in the pay of either the Sheriff of Lanarkshire or the MP Kipman Finlay. Suspicion is that at least a fair number of the committee were actually government spies. Now the question then is, were the agents provocateurs?
Yeah.
So this is the argument. It's one that I have with a number of learned colleagues as well. I go for the idea that it was perhaps suggested that we have a provisional government. Let's have a provisional government, lads. It'll be good for Scotland. And some of the others said, that's a great idea. We'll go for them. We've got them.
I've got them. Yeah.
Well, what happened in April? The government wasn't for moving, and they decided that they would have a rising, an armed rising. It's kind of complicated to figure out exactly where the idea for this actually came from, because we do know that King, that I've mentioned before, another man, Craig, another man, Leeds, there was a group, and we know that they were government spies. And they were very active in promoting this publication for a general strike. Now, it is perhaps ironic that they chose to publish this on the 1st of April. Now, in those days, that didn't have the same resonance as it does with us. But the idea that was on Monday the 3rd of April, all work was stopped. 40,000 in central Scotland stopped. And it wasn't just Glasgow, it was throughout the entire central belt. It was from Ayrshire all through up to Balfron and beyond.
Wow. I mean, that's a lot. That's a large number of people going on to strike. That doesn't happen without a lot of network and organisation behind it.
Exactly. Now, the other thing that was going on at this time was that the English were going to rise as well. And what you were going to have was a coordinated rising. Now, what happened was, as far as we can see, the English waited till the Scots rose, and the Scots waited till the English rose, and eventually, when this went ahead, it went off at half cock, if you like. A group in Glasgow radicals, got together in High Street. Well, I'd say several places, because for obvious reasons they moved around. A group of people, men hanging about, attracted attention of other people. The rumour spread that the workers had taken over Clann Ironworks. Now, Clann Ironworks was not just an ironworks. It made weapons.
Made weapons, yeah.
One of its most famous was, in fact, named after the carronade, a short cannon. They had taken this over, and all they had to do was march out there, and they would be armed. They would have arms for everyone. Well, for a start, not all of them wanted to go. When they met at just outside Glasgow Garden, they hesitated, and a young lad by the name of Andrew Hardy, ex-soldier, this is very, very important for what happened later, he'd seen active service with the Berwickshire militia abroad during the Napoleonic Wars. He said he'd lead them, and he was given half a card by a man named Turner. That card will be matched by the other half, held by a man by the name of John Beard, and you'll meet him in Condorit. He will lead you to Clann Ironworks.
Wow.
So during, well, April, what do you expect? Utterly miserable wet night. They marched through the night to Condorit, arriving in the early hours of the morning. Knocked up John Beard, whose brother was a wee bit worried because he'd been given a card by a man calling himself Andrews, but actually he was Craig, the notorious man. And he'd come out and said, there's an army on its way. So about, we're not sure the exact numbers, round about between 25 and 30 men arrived. Beard's brother asked where the rest of the army was. And they said, don't worry, there's men at Camelin coming to will help you. And Camelin's only about a mile up the road. So in the early hours of the morning, they left Condorit, stopped for breakfast at Castle Carey. That's not irrelevant, because John Beard had a document signed by a certificate, a receipt, if you like, saying that they had provided porter and bread for these men, and that John Beard had paid for it so that he could give this to the provisional government and claim back his expenses. This is going to be for John Beard.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Now, when they left, they split into two groups. Now, this is, again, critical. If you read what Hardy wrote, he took a handful of men. There was about 30 in total, at most. He took a handful, and he went through Bonnybridge looking for weapons. And they didn't batter doors, and they knocked the doors and said, have you any weapons? Now, some people might have old swords as souvenirs from the past, or fowling pieces for frightening the birds, or hunting. Beard took the bulk of the men along the canal bank, Forth and Clyde, and they agreed they would meet up further along. As Hardy went through the town, he met a traveller who was going to Glasgow, and he stopped him and said, don't go to Glasgow. Glasgow is in the hands of the radicals, and the Radical Army have captured Glasgow, because this is the information he's been getting fed. And the traveller thanked him and carried on. And a few minutes later, who does he bump into but a trooper from the Kilsyth troop of the Stirlingshire Yeomanry? And his name, please don't laugh when I tell you, his name was John Nichol Beard. Another Beard. Oh, a double whammy coming here. When he sees the trooper, he says to him, is it true that Glasgow is taken over with the radicals? I've just met some armed men. He was never called at the trial. He was tracked down afterwards. And he said the trooper just stared at him, spun his horse round and raced off.
Wow.
As it was, he was heading for Kilsyth. Because would you believe that on the 4th, before Hardy had set out from Glasgow, a troop of hussars had been sent from Perth to ride hot foot first of all to Clann, in case the works were attacked. Before they got there, they were intercepted and told that, don't worry, there's troops from the Rifle Brigade already stationed in Clann. You go to Kilsyth. Now, why Kilsyth? Because the plan was that the radicals would go to Clann, get the stuff, and then instead of coming back via what we would call the M18 nowadays, the road through Cumbernauld, they would go the back road through
Back
Kilsyth.
road, yeah. Yeah.
Davidson, the lieutenant in charge of the Kilsyth Yeomanry, he took up residence in the Treath Arms Hotel with his troop of 16 men. And Lieutenant Ellis Hodgson joined them with his troop of 16 hussars. So when this trooper arrives and he tells them that there's a large body of armed men heading out through Bonnybridge towards Kilsyth, they're stunned. They're even more stunned because the next person that Hardy meets is a sergeant of the hussars carrying dispatches. So they stop him, they demand his weapons, and he refuses to hand them over. And this is where Hardy, the ex-soldier, comes in. He respects him and he allows him to keep his arms. Gives him a copy of the proclamation of the Scottish government and allows him to carry on. He's carrying dispatches. So he races to Kilsyth. He confirms. But hey, what he says is he met a handful of men.
Yeah.
Critical.
Yeah.
So the troopers take off like bats out of hell and they head for Kilsyth. Meanwhile, our chum Craig has met up with our erstwhile army, and he had left when just before the men left Condorit. He'd left with a Keane, one of the Glasgow radicals, as a bodyguard. Nobody ever sees Keane again. He meets up with them and says, "Oh, we became separated. We saw some troops and we hid and became separated." I think we can all picture what happened. And he tells them, "Look, I'll go ahead to Camelin and get the Camelin men to join you. You go up the hill at Bonnymuir and wait there till they come." So the men, remember, they've marched through the night. They've been soaked.
Yeah.
They've had practically no sleep. They've had one meal since leaving Glasgow. So they go up and they hide out of sight on the moor. Ellis Hodgson leads his troops. They get into Bonnybridge. Now, the obvious thing to do if you're in Bonnybridge is head straight along the road to Falkirk, or technically to Camelin, and then Falkirk and the Ironworks. These men are about almost a mile off the road, up on the right-hand side if you're going to Falkirk. But he meets a gentleman on the road who tells them he saw these men and they're up on the moor. So Hodgson turns his troops and he heads straight for them. What we also should have mentioned is that Baird also is an ex-soldier. And he organises his men at a dyke. And there's a gap, a slap as he calls it, in the dyke. The pikemen guard the gap. The men with muskets, the wall. And this is the important bit. Those who have no weapons stand well back. Ellis Hodgson approaches the dyke and asks to speak to the radical commander, whose name is Baird. He knows the name of the commander. A shot is fired. We don't know whether it was fired by... I don't think it was ours. They were too disciplined. The yeomanry, that's a different kettle of fish. They would be panicky because these guys had never actually seen active service before, or the radicals. We just don't know. So a battle begins, and 3 times the troops, not the yeomanry, the hussars, attack the dyke. At one point, one of the radicals is badly wounded, and one of the soldiers is wounded. There's pulled back. Eventually, Hodgson himself charges the dyke, jumps the dyke on his horse, and confronts Beard, points his pistol at him, pulls the trigger, and it doesn't go off. And at that, they've breached the dyke. Beard gets them to surrender. 18 men are taken prisoner.
Mm-hmm.
So the ones who had no weapons evaporate. 4 of them are wounded. 1 very badly. So badly that they take him to a house and they call a doctor. In the meantime, Hodgson has received a wound in his arm and his horse has been seriously wounded, killed, and dies later. The chap who's taken to the doctor, or taken to the house where a doctor called, doctor refuses to have him moved. He's too seriously injured. So the troops leave him. In which case the doctor suggests that he get in touch with his family and get him the hell out. And they do. So he survives. Hodgson has a problem. His men have defeated the radicals. Now that they're prisoners, the yeomanry want to start sabring them and cut them to pieces. And he actually uses the flat of his sword to bash the heads, the bodies of some of the troops to keep them back. They're prisoners. They've taken, one has a slash down his face. His name is Thomas McCulloch, and he's from Pandora. And the other one has a body wound. They're put in carts and they're marched to Stirling for trial. The day that happens, a Paisley radical by the name of Spears is sent to Straven to tell them that there's a big rising. Not only is there a rising, but MacDonald of Kinloch has arrived with French troops and they're stationed outside Glasgow, the Cathkin Braes to be precise. Join them there. They're going to attack Glasgow. They spend the night making weapons and listening to an Irishman who was out, as they say, in 1798. The next day they take off. They get to East Coldstream, which is about 2/3 of the way from Straven to East Kilbride. And they're told, they meet people, they say, there's no rising. Glasgow's fine. There's lots of troops. Wilson gets a wee bit worried about that. They get to, it was then called Kilbride. And they're told, oh, you're lucky you weren't here an hour ago. There was a big body of troops waiting for you. Wilson knows it's a trap. He says, right, we call it off. But the others say, no, we're going to go on. So he goes to a friend's house and he's going to go home. The rest carry on. They get to Cathkin. No army. Rutherford radicals tell them to get the hell out. The rising has failed. By this time, it's the 6th of April. The rising has failed. The men at Stirling have been captured. Glasgow is under the control of the military. So they drift back. Not one of them makes it back. They're all lifted before they get home. Wilson is lifted, but he manages to get home. So we've now got the radical all lifted. What we did know, up until recently, was that the day that this happened, radicals went out in Paisley, in spite of the military. A group of them went out knocking doors for weapons. Now we know that, and we also know that when they went to Foxbar House, the owner of the house opened fire on them, and they killed a radical by the name of Adam Cochrane. Not quite a year ago. No, it's a wee bit more than that, 18 months ago. I got a copy of an obituary for Robert Grennan from his 3-time great-granddaughter. And she says, now I know what the obituary means. He was one of the men that was out in Paisley. And he gives an account of going to Leechland House. The fellow hands over guns and says, it's a bad deal. It's a really bad thing you're doing. You'll pay for it. They go to Foxbar House and he gives a description of the fight, the battle. And then he explains that what they did was some of them took the wounded and spirited them away, while others disappeared because they knew that the troops were on the way. Her 3 times great-grandfather, had actually been there. Nobody had ever heard of him before until this year. At the same time, one of the, I think it was King, he'd actually been arrested leading a group of men out of Glasgow on the 4th. Because these men, they were armed with pikes. Pikes were easy to make. You batter a pointed thing with a hook. And troops were terrified, cavalry were terrified of them. Because if this hook and the target was the reins of the horse, boom, their man's helpless. So he led these men out. They're going to Port Dundas and they're going to march out towards Falkirk. That's what they were told. Unfortunately, these men weren't experienced soldiers, so as they were going along Stucky Hall Street, one of them managed to clatter a light. And the noise attracted the attention of, you know who, the Glasgow police. And they chased them. So they split up. The only one who was arrested was King. He was taken down to Anderston, brought before the Bailey, Holdsworth, the mill owner, who fined him 5 shillings, took the money out of his own pocket and told him to go about his business. You've no idea how upset the hussars were who were waiting for them at Port Dundas when they realised the Glasgow police had interfered with the plan. When you start putting this together, you begin to realise these men were in a hiding to nothing.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating listening to this description of how militarised Scotland was. And I mean, I know it's a while since the 1820s, a while since the actual Jacobite uprising, and yet it sounds like it's the Wild West out there. And it just makes me wonder, these small groups of men with their ideals, could they ever have hoped to succeed against that kind of militarized context? I mean, it just seemed like it was doomed from the start.
It was.
Yeah.
It was definitely doomed from the start.
It is funny. Here we have Battle of Bonnymuir. Let us never weary in remembering them, or the reasons why they came to this place. Their cause was just. And there's another monument here. On 5th of April 1820, a band of Scots working class radicals fought here for their democratic rights against a troop of horse from the British Army. The radicals took cover behind a 5-foot-high dry-stone dyke located in this field, later known as the Radical Dyke. Where is this gone? Tiny, not a very good dyke. I think it might be this, the Radical Dyke. Makes sense.
In the aftermath, they go and they raid everywhere. They raid Greenock to try and lift people.
So who's doing the raiding?
Oh, the troops.
Troop, right, okay. So
in this case, the Somerset infantry.
Right.
Now, Paisley had been involved. So what was happening? You went, you raided your Glasgow hellman's out there rounding up as many people as he can. In fact, anybody he doesn't like, he's going to lift. There in Glasgow, they lift people in Paisley, but there's so many they have, jail can't take them. So they decide to send 3 prisoners down to Greenock, this group of Paisley radicals down to Greenock. And they used the Port Glasgow militia. Today it doesn't sound much. Let's just simply say, if we put it into a sort of Glasgow context, it would be like asking Glasgow Celtic Football Club to carry out a raid on Ibrox. Yeah, there's a bitter rivalry between the two towns. Now, these men march in, but because of the rivalry, they bang the drum and they flaunt. So people greet them. The official story is missiles were thrown at them. I would imagine a few chamber pots were emptied as well.
Yeah.
But they get the prisoners to the jail, and then they march back. On the way back, more incidents. This time, the troops opened fire. Now, when you look at the wounds, you think these troops weren't aiming. They were blind panic. An 8-year-old boy is killed, shot and killed. A 60-year-old woman is so severely injured she dies as well. A number of people are killed. Others are wounded. The crowd, this time, there's no messing about. They are chasing them for real. But when they get to Port Glasgow, the great crowd stop. And they turn back and they raid the jail. And they take the radical prisoners out. They leave the rest. And they disappear from history. Now, what happens immediately after? The troops arrive. More troops arrive. The Somersetshire, this time, to patrol the town. And they make arrests. Among them, they arrest 7 men, of whom we knew the name of only one, because his wife had written to the paper, and the newspaper, the Greenock Gazette, was actually furious. This man, yes, he was a radical, but he was totally opposed to violence. His name was John Cameron. But can you afford to put them in the jail that the radicals had created? So they send him off to Dumbarton Castle to be held in the dungeons.
Wow.
So meanwhile, we now have to get the people. So there's raids carried out everywhere. Dumbarton, men are arrested for having been in a forge where apparently weapons had been made. Ayrshire, men from Terbolton, Stewarton. They then have what they call perfect tranquility, according to the Glasgow Herald. While they're waiting for the trials to take place in July, a group of troops in Greenock, the Somersetshire, clash with some sailors, and there's a port of sailors in and out of it. They drag one man in and give him a severe beating, at which the crowd, paisley by the Greenock people, rather do take offence at this, and they attack. But before they can do that, 2 policemen appear, and they march up to the door and are promptly shot dead by the troops.
Wow. Wow.
At that, the army guard appear on the scene, and they take all the troops that were in. There was about a half dozen of them in that hotel. Take them. 2 are put on trial. 1 is hanged, and then his body sent for dissection. The dissector, by the way, was the name of Monroe. But you may not have heard of him, but you have heard of Dr. Knox, the famous man with the body snatchers. Well, it's his assistant who performed. The other one is actually sent to Australia, where he presumably met up with the radicals that he was.
So that's the end of part 1 of our story. Next month really focuses in on the trials and the drama of the courtroom, the drama of the juror, all that's still to come. So don't forget to join us for part 2.